Greetings. Welcome to the AI Files podcast, your ultimate destination for staying updated on all things artificial intelligence. You can find us in Apple Podcasts as well as YouTube. I'm Shadab Hussain, your co host of the show. I'm a director of data and AI at Microsoft with over 22 years of experience in the analytics and AI field.
And I'm Jamie Basilico, co-host of the AI Files. As a data and AI technical specialist and architect, I have over 35 years of expertise in data-related and AI domains, having worked with many Fortune 500 companies throughout my career. Please note, this is not an official Microsoft channel. The views and opinions expressed by the co-host are their own and do not represent the views of Microsoft. With that, today, I'd like to introduce Stephen Kaufman, who's with us to cover a very interesting topic around large language model operations. For a little background on Stephen, he brings 30 years of experience across large enterprise customers, helping them understand and utilize AI, ranging from initial concepts to specific application architectures, design, and development, along with delivery. With that, let's bring Stephen onto the stage to dive in.
Hello, Stephen.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
So I just did a little bit of intro for you, Stephen, but do you want to say maybe a couple of other words before we dive into the great topic of LLMOps to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So my background, I have a development background, and so that's the view that I look at this through. So I kind of incorporate both the app dev and AI aspects, and LLMOps is one of those things that kind of encompasses all of that. And so I'm excited to talk about this subject today.
Cool. No, I'm super excited as well. And maybe a little bit of prelim before we get into this is that, I think all of us have been doing obviously some work around AI or large language development over the last, what seems like an eternity, but over the last 18 months. And now that people and organizations are more than just, hey, what is large language model and how do I spell it? People are really now like implementing applications and starting to be like, oh, wow, we need to actually put rigor around large language models. It's literally no different than what you would think about with traditional application development. So, I've seen it firsthand, certainly where people are now like, all right, what do I do? I'm like, well, think about what you've done previously. So I guess maybe my first question for you with that little backdrop is, can you explain what LLMOps, at least what it is to you? What is it? And I guess maybe how is it different than machine learning operations? And why is it important in the context of, developing AI applications, obviously specifically GenAI apps?
Yeah, no, great question. So when we think about LLMOps, it's the combination of the development activities that we're doing with the large language model itself. What are we doing with our prompts? What are we doing with, all of the interactions? How are we then doing deployment? What are the things that we're doing around getting it into different environments, whether it's staging and production, et cetera? How are we dealing with automation? Looking at testing, automated deployments, in the operation part of it. How do we look at monitoring, right? So those are going to be a number of different things that we'll talk a lot more about, but those are kind of at a high level, the things that we have to be thinking about. And there's so many moving parts and so many aspects to what happens as we develop and operate that we need to have these tools and these processes that really help us from this end-to-end process. So, if we think back to, I'll call it the explosion of GPT a year and a half ago or so, everything that we were doing was very manual. We were dealing with the model, we were picking the model, we were deploying the model. Every single stage was really a manual process. And when I'd go into a new environment, I had to go test everything. And that was a very manual process. So now, as we look at where we've, come from, there's automation, there's capabilities, there's tools that allow us to do these things where we truly can have an automated process from front to back.
So it's not just throwing a model out there and hoping for the best is what I'm hearing, right?
No, exactly. I think that, a lot of us were, um, many of us came from kind of the machine learning, I'll call it, kind of background, and making that distinction between, the data scientists and what was happening from creating our own models versus today when we have LLMs and we're interacting with the models that have already been created. There's that difference in view because, when I was creating my own models, and I say it's really all of us as we're doing this, there's a difference in the way that we interact with this. When you would go create your own model, you had to figure out what data are you going to use for this? What is your model going to do? We needed to go and cleanse the data and do whatever transformation on that data. We needed to go and train the model, tune the model, deal with parameters, labeling, all of these things to actually build that model. Then, once we did that, then we needed to validate the model. We needed to package it and deploy it. And then, all of the things that would happen in kind of that manage and monitor aspect. When we think about LLMs, a lot of that has been done for us. So the model has already been trained. The model is already ready for us to interact with it. So, when we think about these pre-trained models, it really becomes something where we are looking more at the interaction. How do I create a prompt? What is that prompt going to do? How do I make sure that prompt gives me back the information that I need? That there's no hallucinations or any of the things that come with interacting with these large language models. But really just at that point, interacting with it. We're not needing to create. We're not needing to go and load the data that it was trained on. We might do things within, utilizing the RAG pattern where we bring our own data set and, we incorporate some of, corporate data into that process. And so then, I can incorporate that, make it so that, my accuracy is there. Perhaps, terms, data that may not have ever been used to train the LLM can be utilized as well.
So, and that was a great explanation. I guess maybe what I'm thinking about is, what do you see as those key challenges around deploying, a large language model, let alone managing that model in a production environment? Like, what are those stumbling blocks that you see most organizations hit once they, like, oh yeah, I want to now move this into production to have my hundreds or thousands of people use that model?
Yeah. There's a couple of things. I mean, one is picking the right model. How are you going to use this? Is this something that's going to be, surfaced within an application that's for internal users, or are you making this public to external users? So that has a big impact on some of the things that we do around content safety, those types of things that come into play.
So I would assume it's like safety, security, networking, all those things kind of rolled into one.
Absolutely. So, once we pick the model and once we get our prompt or prompts, we know what the system is going to do. Then, it's around deployment. It's around operate, monitoring, knowing that, as we think about the concepts of responsible AI, how do I monitor this? How do I keep track of what it's doing so that I can explain it? How do I make sure that it's being fair? I mean, all of the things that we would expect to be able to see in an interaction. But I think the other is when we think about where we're using this, where do I deploy it? What Azure regions am I going to deploy the model into? Do I have a user base that is going to be across multiple regions, perhaps around the world? how much capacity is in that region, and how do I make sure that the requests that I have to the model are being served? Do I put something in place like API manager that can do some of the balancing and some of the round robin capabilities that it provides? And so there's more than just the large language model as I start to think about these enterprise build outs. So those are things that come into play as well.
Yep.
So, Stephen, sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
No, go ahead. Shut up.
Yeah, I was wondering on those lines that in terms of the challenges, does that differ based on whether we're going to use models as surveys, like serverless, or if we use, let's say, hosted models like, the open source and then host them? Does that differ significantly in terms of the LLM ops?
So what I would say is that you're still going to be doing things that are similar. When you think about model as a service, there are things that are being taken care of for us. But I still have a lot of the same activities, right? I still have to know where I'm going to deploy it, my users, how my users are interacting with it. I'm still creating my prompts. Am I sure that my prompt is actually getting me the best information as a response? And then have I tuned my prompt? So the other part that comes into this is cost. Have I tuned my prompt to get the best cost optimization? So how many tokens do I have going in? How many tokens do I have coming out? That has an impact. And so when we think about the prompt, and I know I keep coming back to the prompt, but one of the things that we start to look at is, if the three of us sit down to write a prompt, we're going to have things that are similar in the way that we put that prompt together. But there's going to be things that I might include or that you might include that kind of make modifications. And so is your prompt giving a better response than my prompt? So those variants are things that should be tested. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, maybe picking up on what Shadab was asking, when we think about, let me put it this way, like just recently, a couple of days ago, Meta announced, Llama 3.1 and came out with a whole slew of additions between the 8B, the 70B, but more importantly, the 405B, right? Or the 4 or 5 billion parameter model. Those things could actually be hosted. So to me, at least when I think about things like these hosted models, I now have to worry about a whole additional set of operational aspects, like, the infrastructure related to it, where, what you're talking about as well, that's in addition to all those things. How well are those prompts acting? Do I have biases being introduced? Do I have schema drift or data drift over periods of time? But, I come back to that core part. Operations can mean so many different things to people. Am I solely focused on that infrastructure side, or am I thinking about end to end? And I think that's the important part. People need to consider the start and finish line, and your starting line might be a little bit smaller if you're starting with a models as a service, less to worry about. Right?
Yes. And so I think that part of that is, how do you view that end to end? How inclusive is that? And where do we start? So do we start with trying to figure out deployment? Are we starting with testing and automation? Are we testing with deployment pipeline, starting with deployment pipelines? And is that our entry into the process? The more mature that we are as an organization, we're going to start and continue to build on. And I would encourage everybody to at least start. Don't do things manually. Continue to build on, continue to add features and capabilities as part of your LLM ops, what I'll call kind of end-to-end process. And, Jamie, you brought up something around, deployment. If we think about things like even Phi 3, and I've got small language models that are now able to be deployed on other environments, how does that fit into this process? How do I manage that deployment, the operations perhaps in another another data center, another device. And I'm going to bring in another part of this, which is monitoring. So I would encourage every single organization, everybody, always think about whatever you're doing with AI from the monitoring aspect, what you want to be able to see from that monitoring output backwards. So what are we keeping track of? What are we able to see? What things are going to help us from performance, from cost? You had talked about model drift. Those are all things that I need to make sure that I'm looking at as we have a successful operation. And there's tools that let us do that. And so things like prompt flow, and I'm going to use that as an example. There's a lot of things that prompt flow provides in terms of, giving us the capability to do monitoring, giving us that capability to do the automation testing, prompt variants, right? All of those types of things that I've kind of referred to, we can do within that tool. And so that helps us so that we're not having to go in and code all of this ourselves. And there's I'll call it a low code graphic interface to prompt flow. And then there's the code first interface to prompt flow. And so depending on the different types of roles of people that we're including in our process, we've got the different, I'll call them interactions for different roles to come in and, be productive and aid in the activities that need to be done.
So from what you just described already, like my head's going, oh my God, there's so many things to think about as it relates to LLM operations. But I maybe want to zero in on one of the first things you mentioned, kind of piqued my interest when you talked about, scaling the deployment or the usage of large language models. Again, because I think about in my head, LLMOps means so many different things, but one of those is how do we ensure the scalability of those applications that people are building around a large language model? So, have you wrestled with or seen some things around how you ensure the scalability and the reliability of those models? And one other thing, maybe before you answer that, I think as organizations start to build more, and this might be a little bit harsh the way I'm going to say this, but more than just a quote unquote chatbot, as they start to build things that are more business critical and people start to really rely on them, reliability of those systems and the models themselves are going to be even more important. So
yes.
Are you tackling or addressing some of those things now in, dealing with some of the large organizations that you're working with around LLMOps?
Yes. Yeah. So that becomes really important, that, the part of getting to deployment is not the end. That gets us so that we can start to use the models and start to get it into production. But now when my users come in and they start interacting with the system, I've got the whole operate side that's happening there. And I think that's really where your question leads to, is I need to make sure that as users are interacting with the system, that I can make sure that we don't have model drift, that we don't have bias, that we don't have hallucinations. There are things that I can be doing at the build stage so that I can put in some of those guardrails. I can put in some of the things that really are needed, so that we have some control over the way that the users are interacting with the system, that we don't have bad actors trying to hijack or trying to, kind of interact with the system in ways that they shouldn't and that it was not designed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that is, of course, monitoring. But the other is, if you are embedding this into an application, is this something where you are providing I'll call it kind of an open-ended text box for any end user to come in and put in a prompt? Or does the application itself put guardrails on it? In some cases, I'm working with a company right now where as you interact with that application, you don't necessarily even know that AI is happening behind the scenes. So there are calls to go and, bring back data that's presented to you as items that you can check to help you on the process that application provides. And you don't really have open access to be able to do your own prompts. And so that's a way that they were able to put a little bit more, I'm going to call it control and governance on the front end.
So, Stephen, one question, you touched upon one aspect, and it really piqued my interest, and that is about the cost. Okay. So what happens is that in many cases we have these serverless APIs, particularly the Azure OpenAI, which is entirely serverless, model as service. You only pay by the token. But when it comes to the hosted model, like which you will do it like open source model, Meta, now that is where the cost becomes a little bit tricky. Now, theoretically, they are open source. They don't have a royalty, so they're supposed to be very cheap. But that's not the case. A
Right.
lot of organizations are now reporting that actually it can be costlier than the model as service, right? So, how does the LLM ops, like manage those aspects of how do I keep the cost down or even measure them? Because it's a tricky to actually measure the cost when it is not a model as service.
Right. And I think that I'm going to answer it kind of two ways. One is, does LLM ops, cover this? The other is your idea of, is one really cheaper than the other? And I think that there needs to be a cost analysis and that optimization mindset, no matter which model you pick. And even if I pick, let's pick on GPT-4, for example. I've got a number of different versions that I can pick from. And whether it's 32K, whether it's 4.0, those are going to have different pricing. And so I need to go figure out which model is giving me the results that I need. And I've got to start looking at tokens. Now, every time I make a call to the model, I get a response back that tells me the tokens. But that's in real time. So then the other part that I look at is, are we or can we be looking at something like API Manager, where I can now start to get the information from those calls and save that into a data store. So I'm going to bring in another topic, which is part of the monitoring piece, which is, what data are we sending in and what data are we getting back? With API Manager, I can use the wiretap pattern, and I can go capture the information in the request and response body, save that along with the tokens that were actually used. And now I can have all of that information to start doing cost analysis, but I can also use that so that, the users might be able to give me feedback. This was a good response or this wasn't a good response. And now I can use that to figure out what kinds of information was I sending into the model. Do I need to look at that again? Can I optimize that? So I'm kind of incorporating a couple different pieces, but they're kind of related. But how do I now, collect the data to be able to do my cost analysis to do that optimization? So there's a circle. And when we think about kind of that end to end, and I'm going to share my screen here real quick because I want to show a circle diagram that covers a lot of the end to end. And actually, maybe you guys can, perfect, pull that in. So when we look at these different circles, if we start with the kind of the left-hand side where we're looking at the prompts, we're thinking about what we want to build and which LLM model are we going to use. So when we think about the kind of the end-to-end, I like this concept of the circles in these loops because I'm going to think about different pieces at different stages, but they all end up looping and coming back so that I'm taking feedback from the movement from one circle coming back to give me feedback to continue in that next. So what I mean by that is I'm going to look at the prompts, but then I'm going to start doing different types of prompt engineering and evaluations. So prompt variances to figure out which one is giving me a better response. And so coming back to that cost optimization, I might go look at cost, and that's going to be in the circle all the way to the right when I think about when I really look at quota and cost management and monitoring. I'm going to take the output of those activities and bring it back to the middle circle to be thinking about, what do I change in my prompt? If I'm using zero or few shot learning, am I getting a difference if I continue to add more of these examples, or am I really utilizing too many tokens and I'm paying for something that isn't needed? And so can I start to pare down my prompts? So those are some of the things that we start to talk about.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I'll add one thing on that, or maybe comment on it. When people talk about performance of these large language models, or small language models for that matter, I think there's two different perspectives on how you define what performance is. Performance could be like the latency of response coming back from a model, which is super important. I mean, that's something you still want to monitor, manage, determine how to make it better. But there's also the performance of the output of the model. And it sounds like you've actually hit on both in some cases. But would you say, I don't even know if this is a fair question, but is one more important than the other? Me personally, I think they're both important. But how are you seeing people focus on the performance of the output versus the performance of a latency as it relates to getting that output?
Yeah, they are both essential, because I can have something that works super fast, but if the output isn't accurate, isn't usable, then it doesn't matter how fast the system is.
Right.
So that accuracy really becomes paramount. Now, when we interact with these systems, depending on the way that we've dealt with the interaction and our prompts, we're going to get different types of responses. We're not going to get the same response every single time. And so part of that is, how are you measuring accuracy? So that becomes an important aspect. And what level of accuracy are you considering? And so the use case becomes, an important factor. Once I have that, and I know I'm getting the right responses back, now we can start to work on the actual performance, latency, et cetera, of which region, which data center am I going to? How fast is that call coming back? So, if it takes too long to get a response back, now we're going to have people complaining. But that is different than having data come back that isn't usable or isn't accurate for what they want to use. And I'm making a distinction between accuracy and hallucinations, because there are times that things can be accurate, but the data isn't necessarily detailed enough to what you want. And then I've got to go back and make changes to the prompt, versus I'm getting data back that I was never meant to get back. And so as we test, we want to make sure that we're looking for those different situations.
So let me ask you a question, and there's other things I want to ask as well in the context of LLMOps, things around privacy and security. But you already mentioned like things like prompt flow, which, by the way, the audience may not be totally up to speed on what prompt flow is, so maybe want to explain that a little bit more, what it's part of. But the thing that I think of when you mention prompt flow is I think of tools. Like, what are the frameworks, or what are the mechanisms? Because we could talk about, you need to look at, the accuracy, you need to look at the performance and latency, you got to think about deployment. But are there any things that are helping, the developer, the operations manager actually do that in an automated fashion? So put it another way, are there any tools or frameworks that you would recommend for being able to do this?
Yes. I think that, I'm going to come back to prompt flow, and I'm also going to talk about things like LangChain and semantic kernel as well. And the reason that I'm kind of broadening this is that what are the frameworks that are there to help with development? What are the frameworks that are there that help us build the applications, the workflow, the process? You had Simon on a previous podcast talking about agentic AI. And when we think about AutoGen and the capabilities with AutoGen that let us build these agents, depending on the type of application that I'm running, if I'm creating a traditional application, if I'm creating agents, those all fit underneath the umbrella of LLMOps. I have to know where that application is, and how do I make it so that it's easy to package and fit through this system. So whether you're using an application-based tool, SDK, all of that fits into the automation, the things we've been talking about so far on this podcast. What PromptFlow lets me do is take the information for that application, the interaction, the connections to the large language models. It knows and can get the information about that interaction and start to bundle all of this together. So with the other parts, if we think about PromptFlow end to end, it's part of ML Studio, it's part of AI Studio, and there's the SDK. So earlier I talked about kind of a low-code GUI interface for PromptFlow, as well as a code-first SDK. But the tools that are there let me go through the entire process of, prompt validation, prompt variances, and doing that testing and looking for groundedness. Is it actually, is the results that I'm getting back accurate for what I expect? And so I can start to do that monitoring and that comparison as part of my life cycle before I get that into production. And I can start to get statistics about, okay, how accurate is this? The other thing that PromptFlow lets me do is evaluate the process. And so then I can have flows calling into flows and essentially acting on it to invoke a flow to make sure that that flow is doing what we expect, getting the response back. And so I can start to set up automated tests. So, from each stage, the tools are there that let us set this up, to help us automate. And I'm going to keep coming back to automation, because no matter where you start, I hope that everybody takes away from this that automation is good. Always be doing things to help automate the process. The other reason that I talk about automation on deployment is because there's a couple things that come into deployment. What do I deploy, right? And where am I deploying it? Am I deploying it into staging? Am I deploying it into production, into pre-production? I want to make sure that I have a repeatable process for that, but also that it is a consistent process. The other piece that's happening is that, now that we are getting more and more models, we've got 4.0 that came out. 4.0 mini is now out. We've got some models that are being deprecated. So what is that process to allow me to test with a new model so that I am ready to go when that model is ready, or when I'm ready to start using the new model before it gets deprecated? And so having all of that automation makes that to be a much easier task, much quicker, and makes it so that you can get into production using these newer models that much easier and that much, faster process.
Sort of like the handoff from the old to the new, ensuring that the new is as good, if not better, than the old.
Exactly. And sometimes you may have to go back and modify your prompt. You have to test to make sure that you do that process of, checking for groundedness, relevance, etc. and make sure that you're getting the same response and the same information back, depending on the different models that you're moving up to.
So, bottom line is that any organization that's going to use the LLMs, right now they may not have done it, still playing with like doing the POCs and parlors. They probably, but seems like LLM ops is inevitable. They have to do it. It's better the time. Any organization who is thinking of scaling with AI, putting that in production, should start thinking of having an LLM ops mindset and have a framework and think of how they're going to do it, have formal process around it, right? This is not something that you just deploy and ignore. You have to manage the entire life cycle.
Absolutely. That is so important. You do not want to deploy and have something that you ignore or just assume is out there running and running well.
Mm.
From the very simplest interaction where I might just have a one connection to an LLM, get a response back. That might be on the very simple end. I still want to make sure that I'm incorporating LLM ops, that I'm doing all of the things we've talked about, from testing to monitoring. And I'm going to do that even for the largest of implementations. So it doesn't matter how big your implementation is, you're still going to be facing the exact same issues, just at different scale. But we still need to make sure that we can automate, that we can, incorporate all of these aspects. So it doesn't, that's why I would say just make sure that you are always implementing some level of LLM ops. And the more mature that you get with your solutions, that should be the same thing with your LLM ops lifecycle. That maturity should continue to grow, and the capabilities and the things that you're taking advantage of within these loops also should continue to grow.
Got it.
Yeah, I'm absorbing all that, and I'm also thinking about other things that may relate back into the operations around large language models. And this might be a doozy, and this might be even one for another longer conversation, but where does security and data privacy fit within LLM ops? Like, is it even in the context of it? I would hope it is.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the lines. But
Yes.
What have you seen so far? What have you kind of helped to build?
Yeah, so data security is, again, one of those things where we're going to have different touch points. Data security, I've got a touch point on what information is coming back out of the models and how is that going to be used? What data does that include? But also, if I'm using the RAG pattern where I bring my own data to sit side by side with the large language model, I need to make sure that I know what's going into that data set. I need to make sure that I know how often that data set is updated, who has access to update that data set, because all of that gets indexed and incorporated in with the response that comes back out of the system. And so security becomes a big issue on that front as well. So all of that fits underneath LLM ops. It isn't separate. Okay. And I think that the big piece is that, if you think about LLM ops as this umbrella, the same way that we would think about DevOps, right, in years past, and the way that we do DevOps today, that it's an umbrella that covers the entire end-to-end process. So I need to make sure I'm looking at the things under that umbrella. There isn't something that sits outside of it. So I can't think of security separate or not think about security because I didn't see it specifically in a particular slide or training. All of these activities have to fall underneath that umbrella, from dev all the way to testing, to deployment, to operate.
So for an organization, Stephen, in that case, let's say an organization wants to make sure that they have the LLM ops as a practice and a framework and as a discipline. You talked about the prompt flow, which is a tool in the Azure, right? And it helps you actually manage several aspects of it. But is prompt flow an LLM ops tool, or LLM ops goes beyond prompt flow? It's like basically you talked about APIM and like a bunch of things. And if that is so, then the any enterprise who wants to do it outside the Azure, outside the cloud, are there specific tools which are dedicated to do end-to-end LLM ops?
So there are other tools. I'm talking about specifically prompt flow because I'm focusing on the Azure side of things. You're right, though, that where prompt flow is a set of capabilities and tools that let me automate and do the things that we've talked about within that LLM lifecycle. There are things that are outside of prompt flow that I want to be able to use, like API Manager. And we're going to use Azure Monitor, and we're going to use some of these other services that help us with things like monitoring, with things like doing round robin connections off to the endpoint, or capturing information about the message body and response. So there's other tools that help us, but those also are part of what we're showing here in the circle. They're just more directed types of tools and services that let us do a specific set of tasks.
Great. And what are those tools outside the Azure? Any example, Stephen?
I would say that depending on the cloud that you're working with, I know that AWS has their tools. GCP has some of theirs that are coming along. I would just keep updated and do Google search on what those are. Prompt flow isn't the only one, but that's certainly the one that I want to focus on for what we're doing.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know we've talked a lot about, like, I'm going to call it theory and things that could be done or should be done, but I'd be curious, without naming names, can you give some examples of successful LLM op implementations from, customers in whatever industry that they might be in? Like, have you seen somebody do it well yet? Hopefully you do or have.
So yes, I've seen people do it in stages. And so, there's a lot of things that are part of this. I'm working with one company right now that they have a very large dedicated DevOps team. And so part of what this allows them to do is extend what they're doing today with their just regular DevOps process, but include all of the things with LLMOps as part of that. And so instead of being able to, do the automation that they do today with DevOps and what they were doing, let's call it a year and a half ago, where everything with LLM integration or implementation, where it's all manual, now they can incorporate that and have an end-to-end across whether they're deploying the application components, the LLM components, and have that under a end-to-end process. I would also say that in different industries, you're going to have different aspects of governance, of controls, ways that you have to explain what was done, how it was done. And so the monitoring piece is an important aspect of that. And that's why earlier I had said that we always have to think about monitoring at the beginning of the process. We can't just bolt on monitoring at the end, because we have to be able to explain, here's what was done, how it was done, how the model did what it did, statistics about perhaps its accuracy or other aspects of that. And I find that as we think about the maturity of LLM ops and their interaction with LLM ops, that's where I tell people to start their maturity journey, is on the monitoring piece, then the automation. Where I tend to find companies that I work with that struggle are companies where they are hand coding everything. where they're hand coding their pipelines, they're hand coding their deployments, they're hand coding their testing. That becomes not only time consuming, but the whole reason that we have these SDKs, and again, whether it's PromptFlow SDK or something else, is so that we can focus on the task, not creating some of these frameworks and some of these capabilities that are there by these tools. So then what ends up happening is that they now have double development efforts. They're developing the actual solution, but then they're constantly going back in and changing the development of the testing tools, the deployment tools, and the things that they've hand coded. So I tend to push people to be really looking at the tools that are there to help them, just like they would in any other development environment or development aspect.
Yeah. So that's definitely good advice for any organization looking to implement LLMOps. Yeah, say that one 5 times fast. So that's great. I mean, giving some great insight on how companies should think about things. I guess one of the questions that I would like to ask, and break out your crystal ball on this one, but where do you think future trends are going, or advancements in large language model operations, or at least in the field of LLMOps? Do you see anything on the horizon, or have we reached the pinnacle, which I doubt we have? No. But what do you think is around the corner, or what should be around the corner?
Yeah, I think that as we think about, and I'm not going to call it a crystal ball, I'll just say, as I think about what I've heard and where things are going, we're going to see a lot more capabilities around automation, around testing. I think the other piece is, as we think about the interactions that we have with large language models, are we going to be creating the prompts, or do we provide the information for, let's call it the first call to the LLM, with the parameters, the information, and it's going to create the prompt for us to then use that prompt to call the LLM the second time? And so now, how do we start to monitor that, and how do we start to make sure we're capturing the right data to be able to explain, here is the prompt that the LLM created for us. And so I've got a customer right now that's doing that type of a model and needing to track it and show what it's doing. And so how do we make sure that we are capturing that type of information? The other piece is that, as we think about agents, and I'm coming back and I'm going to incorporate agents and monitoring, because when we monitor all of this information, whether it's going into logs or whether it's, wherever we're storing this, we're going to start seeing things where we have agents that are now monitoring the logs and being able to act on those logs in real time, so that now I don't have to wait for a customer, a user, to come back and tell me, hey, something is wrong. The agent can come back and immediately say, I have an anomaly. I have something that's not right. And I can be doing that in near real time.
And fix it.
Exactly. Yes. And so now that falls underneath this life cycle umbrella of, how do I keep track of what the agents are doing? How do I keep track of deploying agents? How many agents are used? What's the cost of the agents? All of those types of things.
I'm smiling because I think you just opened up a new agent operations.
Yes, absolutely. So that's an interesting aspect, and I love the idea of what you guys had talked with Simon about with agentic AI. How do we bring that now into some of the implementation of what we've been talking about with LLMOps?
That's cool. It's one of those mind explosion things that's going on.
Yeah, it's such an essential topic, Jamie, right? I mean, we all talk about LLMs all the time, and sometimes we forget that how essential this whole LLM ops is. Otherwise, it's like you're creating something magnificent, but don't know how to monitor, how to manage, and it can just all crumble, really.
Yes.
So one more thing, Stephen, on that line, to avoid that whole collapse, What would you advise the organizations who are now thinking of, hopefully after this episode, if they haven't heard of LLMOps yet, they will give it a serious thought and want to start? What would be your advice, or how to avoid some of the pitfalls that people generally make?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that one of the pieces is treat LLM ops as important as the actual implementation itself. So when you're putting together your backlog, don't just put together, here are the requirements for whatever this interaction with the LLM ops are. Include all of the things in your backlog for the LLM lifecycle. Think about what your levels of maturity are going to be as you continue to grow this, and start simple and just start. Look at the tools that are available. It doesn't have to be a big bang, right? Start small, continue to grow, continue to add onto it. It's going to make every part of your application, the operations, that much smoother and easier and consistent. You want that consistency in your process. That's where we start to get into some of the pitfalls, is when we don't have that consistency, when we don't have that monitoring. Those become real painful quickly.
It's good points.
Yeah. Are there some, since you're an expert in this, I'm sure that there would be probably some white paper around it, or some recommendations, like, okay, and maybe set this up this way, or measure these metrics, for example. Are there recommendations like that? If yes, we would love to actually drop in our show notes as well, for people to pursue this further and read up more on this.
Yeah, no, there definitely are, and I'm happy to provide those, and we can include that with the recording. But there's a number of different things that have been put out there around what type of metrics do we want to do? What are the capabilities that are, as we think about these different circles, and again, I'm coming back to prompt flow, but what are the things that are available as part of the SDK? What are the things that you can now do with this? So not only thinking about the use cases, but actual hands-on of how to start incorporating this and how to start working through end to end.
Sounds great. Can't wait to get my hands on some of that additional material. So looking forward to it, Stephen.
Absolutely.
Cool. This is now my favorite, next favorite topic, Jamie and Stephen. I'm going to
love it.
Study on this. So important, actually.
Yeah, no, definitely, especially as organizations start to roll out and really rely on these, large language model applications. So it's going to become more and more important as time progresses. So
yes.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that without proper LLMOps in place, a team in place, and a framework in place, a discipline in place, you really can't scale AI, right? I mean, you can't really get the benefits, the value that enterprise is looking for. So it is that essential. That's how I'll put it.
Yes, completely agree.
Cool. Well, thanks again for spending some time with us today, Stephen, and hopefully we'll have you back when we could talk about agent ops.
I would love that. And thank you very much. This has really been fantastic. Appreciate it.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Talk soon again. Bye, both.